Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief of CraftsmanOnline.com. And we're very fortunate every 2 weeks he comes and visits us on the podcast. Brother John Nagy has returned for another episode. Welcome back, Brother John.
Thanks for having me again, Brother Michael. It's an honor and a privilege.
Every time we meet, I almost want to slip up and say, and my co-host, because I feel like you're at that stage. Of course, Brother John, he's a member of the Pearl of the West Masonic Lodge, number 146 in Newport Richey, Florida, and the Florida Lodge of Research. He's a 32nd degree Mason, 2014 recipient of the Dwayne E. Anderson Award for Excellence in Masonic Education, author of the Better Builder series of uncommon Masonic education books and videos, as well as being the guy who gives so many education workshops. There was a time when I used to stumble over that. I can almost now say that in my sleep. This week he's here as we talk about Masonic Aprons, and I'm surprised. In our previous episode on the working tools of Freemasonry, we had a great series on that. We talked about the visible and the hidden working tools that are present in our Masonic degrees. How did we miss the apron? Is it a working tool to you?
I've had it pointed out many times during my presentations on the Entered Apprentice Working Tools, aka the Apprentice Toolbox. And the overall impression is it's more symbolic, as in a tool of instruction, than an actual working tool. You do wear it, obviously, when you're working, or symbolically wear it when you're working, but it's more of a tool of instruction. And I have used it over the years to point out different aspects of the different things that must be accomplished as you go through the degrees. You actually follow what ritual points to. And I have used it as a mnemonic device so that if you want to remember specific things, the apron is an absolutely fantastic reminder of several things.
If we were to consider it a working tool, it's one of those things that we only see in Lodge. Surprisingly, there are edicts and rules on what we can and can't say when it comes to being a Mason. But the one thing that they're very clear on is that you cannot wear that apron outside of a lodge room unless you have permission from people who outrank you.
Does that mean I've got to take it off right now and stop doing the housework?
But it's also interesting because I think of it as one of the most historical parts of Freemasonry that has freely been transferred throughout several hands over time, meaning that you can go on eBay. I know there's brothers who collect these things. They show up at estates and auction sales all over the country, all over the world. A brother passes away, the family didn't know, they find it in a trunk somewhere, and the next thing you know, you can buy it online for $5.
And there are quite a few brothers that have an unbelievably beautiful mastery talent on creating custom-made aprons. And I have seen some of them, and they are absolutely beautiful.
They used to be, and we did a whole series on them on CraftsmanOnline.com, just a shameless plug, when it came to the painted aprons back in the day, and then, of course, the beautiful embroidery that started taking over it. And it is interesting that, you will have brothers that have these beautiful Masonic aprons that they come to Lodge with their little apron suitcase looking thing, and, they treat this thing like it's a gold bar, either because it was presented to them, it has some significance because it's an heirloom from someone in the family, or perhaps a brother who has laid down his working tools and has gifted it to another brother. So they are very special things. And I think about that every single time I go to put on an apron to walk into a lodge room and go, well, if there was one article of clothing that makes it very difficult to sit and keep a suit jacket buttoned for the entire evening, it's a Masonic apron.
Yes, I've got one of those carrying cases. I have two beautiful aprons that I have. One was given to me as a gift as I was joining a lodge of research up north. They gave me an honorary membership and an apron to boot, and I can't wear it down in Florida because they don't allow the use of outside aprons unless you're actually representing another lodge, another jurisdiction. So I can't wear that. It's beautiful. It's embroidered. And the other one is one I purchased early on as a traveling apron so that when I show up and I want to wear something nice, I put that apron on and wear it at various lodge functions, including some of the presentations that I do around the country.
I identify the apron as one of the strongest symbols in Freemasonry. Yes, we have, Masonic rings that brothers wear, but nothing touches me more than when you go to a lodge and you see a picture, usually from, the 30s, 40s. Sometimes they have them from like the 1800s. And you see just a lodge room packed with brothers, and they all
and we have that in
white
Florida.
apron on as
we
they're
have
smiling and looking
white
at the
aprons that are worn by all members except officers, unless, of course, you're traveling from another lodge and you have an apron that was bestowed upon you as a past master or a grand line officer of some sort, or a committee member. They all have their special aprons, and they are identified as such. And all the insignias on the aprons are basically in conformity with the Grand Lodge requirements. But everybody else wears basically a white apron, unless you're traveling dignitary. As I said, if you come from another state and they allow for it, you wear your own apron, and they've got their bags, carry them in.
So we've discussed the apron, not really a working tool because it is presented, as Brother John said, to a newly made or obligated entered apprentice as a gift. In some jurisdictions, they'll say it's presented as a token. Why are the aprons white? I just gave away the answer. They're a lambskin, which is very rare. And by that I mean that is very rare, but it's also very rare to see a brother who folds out a white lambskin apron. I've never seen that. Usually, you see the white leather apron, which is much more common, and that is what's given to you on the first degree of Masonry. My favorite part is the night and the degree when the brother gets it. They get this in some jurisdictions. In New York, I know it's about a 3 to 4 paragraph long explanation of what the apron is. Having viewed it here in DC, it's the much more condensed, more comfortable 1 paragraph, like, okay, cool. And they're standing there, they're given this thing, and now they're holding it, and they're like, okay, well, how do I wear it? And then we're also told that there's different ways to wear it based on what degree you are in the fraternity. What is also explained is the meaning of the apron as far as how it will stay with the brother through their life. But first, in that apron presentation, there are mentions, and this is why we're lucky to have you, Brother Nagy, to explain this. There are some biblical connections that are made there. So can you explain that lesson of the apron as it would relate to what we could historically glean from the volume of sacred law?
Well, you're not talking just about the Bible. You're talking about a whole swath of ancient uses for aprons. And we'll focus on the Bible, but in all honesty, you've got a lot of different organizations over the centuries and eons that have used an apron to indicate office and also indicate, in particular, our case, purity and innocence. So when you're talking about the Bible, it's not just the Bible. Now, the Bible connection obviously is lamb. And when you've got lamb skin, we're talking about a symbol of sacrifice and also appeasement, as in if you're looking at the apron, or shall I say just the aspect of it being part lamb in the Bible has been classically a symbol of sacrifice, and also one where you're trying to either appease and or make amends by making of the sacrifice. But it also is a symbol of innocence, even in the Bible. So the connection is obvious, not only there, but across the spectrum of a lot of different organizations throughout the years, including those organizations that are based very steeply in the Bible.
I had another connection recently. I was watching the Cisco Kid on HBO because I had nothing to do because, who does have anywhere to go these days? Gene Wilder plays a rabbi in the movie. And the scene where he gets mugged and he's like, no, not the Torah. Not. And I'm like, oh, he's wearing a style of an apron. And I'm like, there must be deeper connections to this than beyond what we're told in that first degree when our aprons are handed to us as newly obligated entered apprentices.
And this is what I love about ritual. You can take a simple thing that is presented and explained in ritual, and if you know historical connections to that thing and biblical connections and literary connections, you can run and run and run with it. And yet, when you understand the premise to which it is put forth, this is a symbolic lodge. And so therefore, what does the apron symbolize? Well, we're told it's purity and innocence. And yet, when you know operative application, you put it on so that you don't spoil your clothes. You allow it to wear, allow it to get dirty so that what is underneath, including your very skin, doesn't get harmed. So it is a material that is put forth in the operative sense so that when you do your work, you don't get harmed, and that which is protected by the apron doesn't get harmed. So when we look at it from a speculative standpoint, well, if we're going to work, we're going to get our hands dirty. We're going to get our clothes dirty. We're going to have the apron be damaged rather than us. Now, I just went from operative to speculative and said, having it damaged rather than us. It is a protection. And yes, we look at it as a sign, a badge of a Mason, but a sign of purity and of innocence. And if you want to wrap it all together, we are going to be doing work our entire lives. We are going to be working within our family. We're going to be working within our community, our tasks that we put forth to honor, respect, and support our belief in God, along with our daily vocation. And the apron is to be worn not just symbolically in lodge, but it is to be adorning our very being from that moment on. And the thought is, we don't stop working. We allow the apron to experience the ravages that occur to cloth material as we work without us being materially harmed ourselves. And yet, whatever work that we do, we want to make sure that if we're tearing up that apron in any way, shape, or form, or dirtying it, it's not with anything that is not virtuous and anything that is immoral. We want to make sure that if we are making that apron work for us, that nothing that it gets exposed to is immoral, unvirtuous, it has integrity, or we don't want it to lack integrity. We want to make sure that all the things that purity and innocence, as in blamelessness, everything that we engage in, we remain pure and we remain blameless in any other way, fashion, or form than saying, yes, you are the cause of the betterment of society, your family, and worship to God.
It's interesting you talked about, and you did the transition from operative to speculative, because I find myself now, like, forget about those guys, the unicorns around the campfire. I want to hop in Doc Brown's time machine and travel back to when we had stonecraft guilds and those meetings. And the reason why is because the apron has been a part of Freemasonry as long as we've been creating the portraits and the images of it. I think all of us can remember or can recall seeing the image of George Washington famously with his Masonic apron on, standing at his place as the officer of the lodge. I'm curious, is this one of the few things that has survived over time? Because we do have the working tools, but as you and I have mentioned before, they kind of look like the little tools from the old Operation game back when we were a kid, but we still are wearing, symbolically at least, Masonic aprons.
The working tools were only moralized later on in the 1700s. They were there as props to the speculative plays that we put on. And as Freemasonry grew up, they started adding more and more light and moralization to all the props that they had exposed the candidates to. So when you're talking about the apron, think about the following. Imagine an apron, and it's wrapped around your waist, as is in all speculative lodges. But instead of having the little square, the square actually goes below the knee. It actually drops well below the knee. And it's wider. And imagine instead of that triangular flap that you see dangling by the belt or the wrap that goes around your waist, that we're telling the entered apprentices, oh, you got to have that flap in a certain way, which, I've always thought of that as a hazing of sorts, because they've got to keep on flipping that thing back up because it's going to continually fall down unless they've wrapped it around their body to the point where it can't possibly fall down because it's stretched around their belly. But imagine that triangular flap all the way to the point where it's up to your chin. And instead of at a point, you have a keystone, elongated keystone, where the widest part is at your belt line and the narrowest part is up by your chin. And at the top of the keystone, you have a strap on either part of the corner that wraps around your neck. Well, what you've got is a standard apron that a workman would be using. And I've got one. I've got a leather apron that I use for spot welding and what have you, woodworking, because I don't want to damage my clothes. Spot welding is notorious for splattering all sorts of sparks and making holes in whatever fabric you're wearing. So what I do is I have a leather apron that goes all the way up to my neck, as wide across my chest, and it straps around my back. What we have now is an unbelievable simplified apron. But if you had the apron of a speculative Mason, but in operative form, that baby, if you were wearing an apprentice style, you'd have it buckled around the back of your neck and it'd cover your chest all the way down to below your knees. And of course, because of a misreading that occurred early on in speculative origins, you had two other classifications. You had the fellowcraft and master mason, but prior to speculation, a master mason was a fellowcraft and vice versa. So they created the fellowcraft out of ignorance in the beginning, and we've kept it now as a second, and of course the master mason as a third degree that actually was an innovation to the craft, because it was only that one degree, apprentice, and where you were a full-fledged member. And the fellowcraft was the guy who was running the lodge. Of course, in the operative world, you had a fellowcraft as the master of the lodge, and he wasn't a master mason in the sense that we use it. He was a master mason fellowcraft who just happened to be master of the lodge. So we've got now 3 degrees, and we've got to figure out, all right, now we've got 3 degrees, and we had the way that the apron was being used as an entered apprentice. And obviously those were the beasts of burdens. Those were the ones doing all the work. The fellowcrafts weren't swinging stone unless they were showing somebody how to do something. They were instructing the apprentices, and the apprentices were doing the work. So the apprentices had that flap turned up, and the fellowcrafts had it down. Why? Because you get hot and you're not the one that's doing the work. So you don't need to have that protection in any way, shape, or form, unless you're going to bring that flap up to demonstrate and then back down again. So you've got a variety of different ways of wearing it now. And I will tell you, if you come from 2/3 of the American right, you will wear the fellowcraft one way and the master mason the other. 1/3 of the jurisdictions in the United States actually have that in reverse.
Wow.
Now, you're probably saying, John, how did you come up with this incredible, piece of information.
Right.
Well, I won't give specifics. What I will say is there's a great resource online that had this information up there till about 10 years ago. And I stumbled across it about 15 years ago. And then it disappeared. And that page literally disappeared. The owner of the site took it down for some reason. And I contacted the owner about 7 years ago saying, hey, at one time you had this information up there. Why isn't it there now? And it must have been taken down and I forgot to put it back up again, was the comment. So what I did was I got onto Time Machine, which is a wonderful resource.
Love the Wayback Machine. Yep. The
Wayback Machine. And what I did was I went back to that site and went back about 15 years ago. And bam, there was the page. And I downloaded it and put it in my archive as fast as I could. And the interesting thing is that the page showed about 2/3 of American Rite wearing the aprons on the fellow craft and master mason one way and 1/3 the other. Now, it's not a complete list, so it might be half and half, because there's about maybe 15 or 20 states that had not registered whether they had the flaps one way or the other, the folds or the tucks. But from the information that I had, we're talking about 2/3 one way and 1/3 the other. And which was like, for me, just like mind blowing, because, well, we've had this thing unaltered since time immemorial and it's universal. And then you come to find that no, that, it sounds really good, but it's not true. That's a Masonic unicorn, by the way, right there.
I knew we'd find one. They pop up in just about every episode. And hopefully there's someone playing at home that's flagging all of these, because we are going to do an episode on Masonic unicorns, because I have had people ask, like, when you guys talk about that, I wasn't here for the inside joke. What does it all mean? Don't worry, it's coming.
But in answer to your original question, would the operative Masons have aprons on during their meetings? I'm going to speculate with a disrespectful, no way on God's green earth would they be wearing aprons during a business meeting. Let me tell you why. Because in the business meetings, they're going to be eating, drinking, singing songs, and talking business. Why would they want to have aprons on unless they wanted to protect their clothes from the food and the drink?
Right. And if this is back in the 1700s, that was not a concern.
Exactly. So when we're talking about operative craft, the only reason that they would ever wear an apron is if they had been on a work site doing actual operative work.
Right.
Why on God's green earth would they want to have an apron on during a business meeting? Whereas, we as symbolic Masons, when we do our work, well, our work is showing up at lodge, is talking business, is putting on degrees. So therefore, we are doing the work of speculative craft Masons as opposed to operative.
Well, if only the time machine existed in real life and we could go back and see what was going on, that would be fascinating. Another point you got onto and talked about the style in which how Masons wear their aprons. And I've been able to see degrees in a handful of jurisdictions. And I always feel bad because really it's only explained, at least in the ones that I've seen, in the first degree as to why, and you get the answer and you're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And thank you for the full explanation.
Yeah, particularly with the aspect of this is a truncated version, shrunk down. And I
just as you explained it, I'm following it along. I'm like, yeah, that's how the ritual flows. I get it. And then you get to the fellowcraft degree and it's like, well, here's how you wear it, and wear it this way until the Master Mason degree. And then you become a Master Mason and it's like never revealed as to why it's changed. So thank you for bringing some insight into that. Hopefully we have a grand lecturer or somebody on a work committee that's listening that'll be like, hey, you know what? Let's be the first jurisdiction to bring in that story to kind of close the circle. That'd be great.
Let me tease a little bit for those individuals who are listening intently for some gems. This is absolutely what I call a coach-inspired tease. And I actually do this during my presentations. There's a part of within ritual, depending on what jurisdiction you're in and what degree you're in within that jurisdiction, where they say, well, you tuck it in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And then the explanation is, so you can put your tools in that tuck.
Sure. Like they're not going to fall right out.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you hear the grammar, and I'm going to go through some of the liberal arts here. You go through the grammar and you hear what is being said and you blink because you hear the words. They make absolutely no sense deeper than on the surface. Oh, here's an explanation. I'm supposed to believe it. But logically, we are now evaluating it from a fellowcraft level. We're logically looking at that. And as you said, the tools fall out. Why would you want to, give an explanation like that? Logically, that makes no sense whatsoever. Then you go into rhetoric and you say, oh, that's beautiful. I love it. It's elegant. It doesn't make any sense, but God, it sounds pleasing to my ears and I'm persuaded. And then what happens is you get to the fourth liberal art and you're doing the math and you go back to the logic and you're saying, no, I heard it. Doesn't make sense. It's beautiful. But when I do the math, things don't add up. And then when you get to the fifth one, geometry, and you look at what it is that's going on, it's not about the tuck. It's about the fold. Because if you understand geometry and what that fold represents,
wow,
you recognize
angles.
And once you understand that fold is getting you halfway to the answer. And if you go one step further, what happens is you recognize that with just a flat surface and the right folding techniques, you can create what's right. And I'll leave it at that.
See, he's so good at this. And you think, listener, he only does this on the, no, I'll have private conversations with him. And it's like, he's a great teacher because you don't give away the answer. You point people in the direction to go find it if they're really looking for it. So,
Michael, I swear I was focusing on that tuck for years. And then I said, it's one of these things where purposeful distraction, when I stopped being distracted by the tuck and looked at the actual fold, I said, oh my God, it's geometry. Mind blowing. They got me halfway there. And all I had to do is take one more step. And I said, okay, that's why they do it.
This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. He did it again this week. Our brother, John Nagy, for giving everybody a little homework lesson until we catch back up again in 2 weeks.
You're most welcome. You going to do your wrap up?
And then I'm going to figure out what this fully means because I'm still trying to figure. I'm also halfway there. But I will say, if Masonic education is important to you, you can get our email newsletter. That's at craftsmanonline.com. Also, new episodes of our podcast, they're available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, it's not about the tuck. It's about the fold.
Fold.
Yeah.
Good night.